Okay, this is part two of the children's spiritual formation. And I want to pick up where I ended in the last video about church not being about programming, but reciprocal mutual formation, right? So much of our efforts are focused on programming. And I understand programming is important. I'm not saying that it's not. But when all of our emphasis is on developing, and then perpetuating formation, I think we've lost what is really core. Excuse me. When all of our work and effort is about developing and perpetuating programming, not formation, programming, then we've lost what it is that is at the core, reciprocal formation. And then I mentioned it in the home should not be about passing on our faith, rather cultivating the unique faith of our children. So let me develop that a little bit more. When we talk about children's spiritual formation, even adolescent and even adult, it's really about cultivating their faith journey, cultivating their journey. Consider this quote from Psalm 145, 4 through 8. Let each generation tell its children of your mighty acts. Let them proclaim your power. I will meditate on your majestic, glorious splendor and on your wonderful miracles. Your awe-inspiring deeds will be on every tongue. I will proclaim your greatness. Everyone will share the story of your wonderful goodness. They will sing with joy about your righteousness. The Lord is merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry, and filled with unfailing love. Now, when we talk about passing language, which is so prevalent in our churches, really, and not just in the United States, across the board, um, what often comes to mind is taking something and handing it off to the next person, the next generation. When I've spoke on this theme, on these ideas of children's spiritual formation, even written some on this, what I always have in mind is the idea of like runners in a relay handing off the baton, right? Something is being passed on. But I'd like you to consider this quote from Sharon Ketchum. Quote, it's a little long one, so hang in there with me. If a youth's role, a child's role, is to only receive faith, they're not being welcomed into a faith in which they are expected to participate and contribute. People are not empty vessels into which we pour knowledge about the faith, and certainly not faith itself. Passing language ignores the agency of the receiver. Might the expectations of an adult who seeks to pass faith underestimate the need to engage with youth and children in conversation, in dialogue, and exchange that will further shape mutual understanding and experience of God. At worst, passing language can degenerate to adults controlling a youth's or a child's knowledge and experience of faith, neglecting to invite youth to join with the community's faith, end quote. What do you think about that? Reflect on that just a little bit, maybe rewind to listen to it again. You know, the parents have really been encouraged to pass on their faith. But I want you to consider this, what she says here. Passing language ignores the agency of the child. It ignores the created image that we addressed in the last lecture, right? They're created in the image of God, and as such, they have something to say. When we pass on something that is already predetermined, I'll explain that in a minute, we ignore their agency. If children only receive faith, and I'm saying only, if they only receive faith from their parents, from those who have gone before, we're not fully welcoming them nor expecting them to participate. And what I'm saying here is we, generally speaking, have predetermined in a kind of a box, if you will, that this is how you're going to worship, this is how you're supposed to dress, this is how you're supposed to do church, this is how you're supposed to read the text, and we've predetermined it, we've kind of boxed it up, and we've passed it on to them and said, okay, if you're going to be a part of us, then you have to adhere to this. Now, I may be overstating it just a little bit, but maybe not. Think back to some of the churches that you've been a part of or churches you grew up in. Our churches don't like children and adolescents asking questions. do they? Maybe their agency is being denied. And just maybe when we do this, when we prepackage faith, God is treated as a static commodity to be consumed rather than a relational being to be engaged. Children become consumers. Think about that. Children become consumers and parents become faith distribution managers. So I want to talk about this cultivation language. Now we confess that we serve an active and living God, not a static God, not a commodity that is passed on from one generation to the next. And we confess, we believe that we want to cultivate the unique faith of our children. Doing so invites them to merge their story with God's story. Nurturing the God given faith of children helps them develop their own identity in Jesus. So, what I want to do is I want to kind of build off something that John Westerhoff says Jesus' way is the way of being with, right? And I'm going to give you four components here that I'm going to develop here. What does it look like to cultivate their faith? Well, first you got to prepare the soil, right? You enter into their lives and you remove and address obstacles. And depending on the systems, depending on context, depending on the families, those obstacles are going to look different, although they very much may well be the same from one spot to another. You create a place for safe questions, and also you have a posture of learning. Be willing to learn. You foster intergenerational community, and then this way of being with, this witness. You're not doing ministry to children, you're not doing ministry for children, you're doing ministry with children. And so, in this sense, then you sow the seed. Part two. So, you prepare the soil, now you sow the seed. Of course, the prime material is Christ, right? You teach Christ. You look for and be aware of teachable moments. And for different families, for different churches, this might look different. For my family, it's always when we're on a drive or we're out eating ice cream or something like that. I remember one time being in Panama City Beach, Florida. We stopped at Baskin and Robbins to get some ice cream, and there was this beautiful rainbow. And I remember that an opportunity, took that as an opportunity to teach my children, to remind them about the promise of God. Beautiful rainbow. What does that stand for when we see the bow in the sky, right? Um, it might be necessary as you sow the seed to bring in other teachers, experiences that children learn differently, right? Don't always use the same teachers who teach the same way and think like you. Bring in different people, diverse people from different backgrounds, different understandings, different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Variety, right? Who can present the gospel, teach Christ from perspectives. Maybe in my tradition, we've not historically used instruments, but so many of our children are artistically inclined. What about drawing? What about expressing faith through music? What about drama, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You develop trust when you do this. You develop transparency. You develop authenticity. And then you provide good, solid, age-appropriate theology. So I'm not against age appropriate, and we took care of that in the psychosocial. Age appropriate is appropriate, right? But let's think about what it looks like to cultivate their faith in mutual intergenerational environments. Number three, nurture for growth. So prepare the soil, sow the seed, nurture for growth. This is about empowering and developing their environment so that they might grow to the fullest. Actively take care of obstacles. So as the young plant is growing, if you will, you're actively removing obstacles, right? You're watering, you're providing sunlight, fertilizer, etc. What does that look like in a church and in the home? You're creating space to let God do God's thing, right? God does the best work when we get together, cultivate environments, and remember the witness presence. And this is where I'd like to introduce this idea of spiritual pedagogy. Um, uh, pedagogy is an ancient Mediterranean idea, concept that technically meant one who was a child tender. That is, someone who served as a custodian for the young. They were a constant companion. The spiritual, and I'm borrowing the word pedagogue here and tying it together with spiritual and thinking about our context today. A spiritual pedagogue journeys with the child, helps call them into the image of Christ, invites them into active participation in the kingdom of God, and together they serve others and live out God's love. And then fourth, encouraging fruitfulness. That is, how do you connect belief to behavior? What does that look like? Of course, this is going to require pruning, right? Teaching. And Deuteronomy 6, 6 through 9 comes to mind. That verse 6 there in Deuteronomy 6, upon your hearts, keep in mind to be in one's constant reflection. They are to be committed to memory, as the idiom makes clear. Verse 7 there says, you must teach. To teach and impress by frequent repetition and admonition, must impress the words of faith into the thinking of children. A good translation of this impression is to engrave by inscribing with indelible sharpness and precision. And the idea of this word presents this idea of an engraver, of a monument with a hammer and chisel, painstaking care, etching a text into the solid slab of granite. The sheer labor of the task is daunting, but once done, the message is there to stay. That's the idea here. It's constant sometimes, and it hurts, but it's over. It's difficult. Sometimes it's tough, right? Over. And sometimes there's great joy and happiness. Over. Constant repetition, whether at home, walking, lying down, looking for those teachable moments, sitting, walking, right? Together they encompass all of human effort. Laying down at night, rising in the morning, together speaks of the totality of time. Identify the fruit. What are the gifts, the charisms that the child is displaying? And charisms over time shift and grow and develop depending on the needs of the church as empowered and enabled by the Holy Spirit. And of course, always, always, always enable and encourage questions. So prepare the soil, sow the seed, nurture for growth, and then encourage fruitfulness. Of course, all of this must take place, I believe, in intergenerational community. There is a tendency in our churches, particularly in the West, um, to kind of head towards segregation of the generations. And particularly in the last 100 years, our culture has systematically separated the generations. And there's kind of four society-wide factors here. Now, I think before I get that, I want to say that age-graded public education, this movement from extended to nuclear family, prevalence of retirement and nursing homes, growth of preschools, all of these are indications of this systematic separation here. And churches have been one of the few places where all generations still gather. However, societal trends have influenced the segregation, the age segregation in churches as well. There is this cultural influence. Generally, there has been a move towards age segregation in our culture, and the church has basically adopted it. One of the marginalized age groups in our churches are our elderly, if we're being honest with ourselves. Okay, what about church growth? Church growth strategy. Church growth strategies have perpetuated. They've built on this so-called missional principle that people want to become Christians with others like themselves. Promotion of homogeneity around age and stage of life. That's big. And those models have, even though they're 20, 30 years old and have come back out and said we were wrong, that model's still out there. There's also heightened individualism, right? This is a dominant cultural ideology evidenced in our worship wars. Basically, our own individual or group's happiness and relational satisfaction needs to take priority over the needs of the whole faith community. This is empowered in part by consumerism. So when individual needs are paramount, churches tend to offer special programs for children, for teens, for middle and older adults, so that individual age stage needs can be met more conveniently. And then what happens is what Stuart Bond called years ago when he started critiquing youth ministry, the one-eared Mickey Mouse. The one-eared Mickey Mouse, where the youth ministry is kind of separate from the body of the church. All we've done is we've incorporated individualism into how we operate as a church, and we've perpetuated that model. So now we get all of these silos. We have youth ministry, we have children's ministry, we have men's ministry and women's ministry and older adult ministry, whatever you would call those, singles ministry, et cetera, college ministry, et cetera, et cetera. And we just perpetuated this reality. So cultural influence, church growth strategies, individualism, and finally developmental psychology. Perhaps the greatest reason why age and stage is so pervasive in the church is because we have adopted carte blanche age and stage psychology. Now, I've done a whole lecture on this, so I'm not opposed to that. It's important that we're aware of it, but it ought not be the driver. It ought not be the driver of the spiritual formation of our people, right? We have allowed educational, developmental, and cognitive psychology models to supersede theological models of spiritual formation. And that's what I'm pushing back against. I'm not saying they're not appropriate. A great deal of my work has been in psychosocial development of adolescents, right? I'm not opposed to that. But when that supersedes theological, image driven, agency realities of those who were born in the image of God, we got some real problems there, right? So we need to bring the generations back together. You're going to hear more about this as we go through the course. Creates a sense of belonging, provides support for troubled families, better use of resources, character growth, sharing one's spiritual journeys, right? When we talk about sense of belonging, I know that the separate ministries and churches are like, well, we got to have a children's ministry in order to attract. I get that. I get that. But is the program driving? What's the driver there? I want to critique that. I want to slow down and think about that, right? So what I am saying here is, if we're going to be effective in shaping the faith journeys of our children and adolescents and really adults, we've got to be in this together. We've got to be this intergenerational, mutual organism that does faith together, withness, right? Not two and not four, but together. We're in this together. Okay, I'm going to climb down off my horse here, my soapbox. I hope that makes sense. I've given you now in the last couple of weeks that's important psychosocial stuff to be aware of, but it's not the driver, right? It informs, but it does not drive. What ought to be driving here is this reality that we're created in the image of God. Children are to, as such, they have agency. As such, they have something to say. As such, they have something to teach adults in the church. They're not the church of tomorrow. They are the church of today, period.